Next, we're going to go over each of the three plant organs: roots, stems, and leaves. But let's start from the bottom up. Let's start with roots, like those amazing strangler fig roots that you see from the famed Angkor Wat in Cambodia. There are two main types of root systems: tap roots, like we see in dandelion species here on the left, as well as fibrous root systems, which are employed by the grasses. The tap root, whether in a dandelion, or as my kids call them, puffballs, those are the ones that have the wind-blown seeds, whether we're talking about dandelions or oak trees, the taproot is going to provide structural support. It's going to prevent that plant from toppling over and also making those weeds very hard to pull. The lateral roots on plants are lined with little microscopic root hairs, which is how the plants are going to absorb water and minerals from the soil. Question: how does the form fit the function of those microscopic hairs? If their primary function is the absorption of water and minerals, what would we expect the physical structure to look like? Very high surface area to volume ratios, facilitating the absorption of water and minerals. In other words, those tiny little hairs have lots of surface relative to their volume. And if you look at their internal volume, isn't the plumbing just remarkable? That is one tiny little root hair, a cross section of it. That's mind-blowing. Animals like this elephant and this human, they live in the same world as these plants. Thus, they have to operate under the same laws of physics. Therefore, we would expect to see high surface area relative to volume ratios in animal organ systems whose functions are also to absorb or exchange materials with their environment. And as predicted, this is exactly what we see. So take the capillaries, for instance, as part of the cardiovascular system. Capillaries, their walls are just one cell thick to facilitate gas exchange. They have lots of surface relative to volume. Why? Those tiny little vessels need to pass oxygen and glucose to respiring cells and take up carbon dioxide and metabolic wastes. We see high surface area to volume ratios in the long, small intestine, which is lined with these little projections, which are very similar to root hairs, with high surface area to volume ratios. Why? What is the primary function of the animal small intestine? To promote nutrient absorption from the intestinal tract into the vascular system. And lastly, we have the alveoli. Those are those little minuscule air sacs that are at the terminus of the bronchioles. High surface area to volume ratios in the alveoli is going to promote efficient gas exchange. My broader point here: animals and plants operate under the same laws of physics, so we see physical similarities between these organs, between root hairs and capillaries, for instance. But let's get back to plants. Question for you: why is it wise for farmers to plant species like hairy vetch in the fall in Arizona? Hairy vetch is a species known as a cover crop. And cover crops are how us humans have farmed for thousands of years before the invention of synthetic fertilizers that are actually made from fossil fuels. So we're going to return to the nitrogen cycle and how humans are completely disrupting it in our final module. But for now, recognize that certain classes of bacteria can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Recall that the atmosphere is primarily nitrogen, and some microbes can bring it from the atmosphere into the soil, where other bacteria are then going to convert it into a form that plants can assimilate into their tissues. As we'll discuss later in this learning activity, nitrogen is usually the limiting element to plant growth. So, in what's known as the Green Revolution, beginning in the 1940s, modern agriculture began juicing the system, if you will, with these synthetic fertilizers created from fossil fuels, which has led to us being able to feed billions more people, but it's also created ecological calamities like dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico that are hundreds of miles across. We're coming back to the nitrogen cycle. However, cover crops like that hairy vetch or something else you may be more familiar with, Arizona alfalfa, they're so beneficial because these plants also have the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, bringing it into their tissues. Then when they die, turning those cover crops over into the soil enriches it with a pulse of nitrogen without the use of synthetic fertilizers. And how is it that the legume family, known as the Fabaceae, are able to fix nitrogen while other plants cannot? Certain species of plants, like the legumes, which includes beans, peas, clovers, alfalfa, mimosas, long ago entered into a mutualistic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. Those are the little spheres that you can see in the image here. So in this relationship, the fungus is fed glucose by the plant. You can see the fungi actually tie into the roots of the plant, and the plant is bringing glucose into that fungus. And in exchange, the plants receive nitrogen in a form in which they can use. Those fungus have entered into a mutualistic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which they house inside of them. So these relationships where both species benefit, that's an interspecific relationship known as mutualism, where both species benefit, and we're coming back to that concept as well. So again, the tricky part with plants is how else plants have modified their roots to perform different functions other than absorption. So for example, storage roots like beets and carrots. They're going to do just what their name implies. They're going to store energy for the plant, often through a period of dormancy like winter or during droughts. And then when conditions are favorable, they're going to jumpstart plant growth with providing the stored nutrients to regrow photosynthetic tissue. And it makes sense if you look at the chemical breakdown of a carrot. It really is a chemical storehouse of water, carbohydrates, which is the energy, protein, and fats, all the good stuff to produce green photosynthetic shoots when conditions are right. Why in the heck are these mangrove roots growing up and out of that water? The answer is because that water, with all of the detritus decaying in it, is anaerobic. It has very little oxygen in it, and those mangrove roots need oxygen. Wait, I thought plants do photosynthesis and oxygen is a waste product that they're getting rid of. Well, that's true, but where do plants do photosynthesis? In their roots? Of course not. They're doing photosynthesis in their leaves. Those roots still need oxygen to burn glucose and create ATP in cellular respiration. Hence, the evolution of the pneumatophores in anaerobic mangrove swamps. These are modified roots that are used to facilitate gas exchange. If we look more closely, the pneumatophore roots are lined with tiny pores that are going to funnel oxygen down to those respiring mangrove roots in that anaerobic swamp. Think about that. Roots have been modified to essentially serve as a respiratory system in these plants. It's really remarkable. So, if you've never visited one, tropical rainforests are actually quite dark. Sunlight is in short supply on the forest floor. Hence, the evolution of the aerial roots of the strangler figs in the genus Ficus. The fig seeds are actually going to germinate way up in the canopy of a host tree. And then these little epiphytes are going to send specialized roots that grow rapidly downward from the top branches of the host tree in the hopes of reaching the ground and taking root. The strangler fig is essentially using an already existing structure, this host tree, to access sunlight. It's brilliant. And although strangler figs are not direct parasites, so they're not stealing phloem, they're not stealing glucose from the hosts, when the strangler fig leafs out above the host, it actually blocks sunlight from reaching the host tree, which ultimately starves it and kills it. The host tree then eventually decays, and we're left with this lattice of strangler figs, which are super fun to climb, by the way. We had the opportunity to play in some in Thailand. Because of those moist conditions in the tropics, root systems of many of the tallest trees are surprisingly shallow. So, to compensate for that, these trees have developed buttresses, which essentially are going to give architectural support to the trunk of these massive trees like the diptocarps. The adventitious roots of maize, or what you probably call corn, are called prop roots. They're named so because they support tall, top-heavy plants. So all roots of mature maize plants are adventitious. So that's just a term we use to describe a plant organ that grows in an unusual location, such as roots arising from stems or leaves. So in summary, roots can be modified to perform a whole host of functions. They anchor plants like the taproots in dandelions. They, of course, absorb water and minerals using root hairs with high surface area to volume ratio. And in some species, they've entered into a symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, which allows them to fix nitrogen. Roots can store carbohydrates for when spring springs in species like carrots and beets. Roots can be sites of gas exchange, like we saw with the pneumatophores in mangrove swamps. And roots can even be modified to strangle, like we see in the famous strangler figs.